Okay, so greetings and welcome back to racial and ethnic minorities. Um, this lecture is for the dates of September, I believe it's 8th through the 10th. So that week, obviously Labor Day, you have off. You can still look at this lecture and complete the assignments whenever you want to during that week from the time it's available until the due date. But this is for those readings for September 8th and the 10th. And so the only thing that you were assigned for both of those days was basically the intro to your textbook. And so I believe that intro for racial and ethnic minorities, the intro was why, I think like why we discuss race or why we need to discuss race. So you were supposed to read that intro to kind of bring you into this text. So this is just a quick lecture to kind of highlight some of the things that they're talking about and to kind of get the conversation started around why we need to discuss race, why this class is necessary. And then we're going to go into the various essays and some of the additional readings that help to support a lot of the theories that you find in these essays. One of the things, or this is a quote that I think is very useful for this class, and it says, "Silence only begets further misunderstanding and inhibits progress." So when we don't have conversations about a particular thing, if we are not open and honest about our feelings, if we're not open and honest about our thoughts, if we're not open and honest about our realities with people who are willing to hear and accept those realities, who are willing to believe our realities, and who are interested in seeing a better reality for everyone, then we can actually lead to some tangible, permanent, systemic change within our society. And this is related to any level of inequality, right? Or any type of inequality, whether it be along class lines, whether it be along racial lines, whether it be along gendered lines, right? Whether we're talking about sexuality or any type of identity. If we're quiet about it, then it only leads to further misunderstanding as people start to construct their own ideas about that particular thing. If we don't talk, if we're not vocal. And once people begin to construct their own reality and they have what's kind of like more of an eisegetic analysis where you are in your own head and you're creating these ideas around this thing, as opposed to having an open and honest conversation, then you can't ever move forward, right? You can never move forward. You can never propel and create a better space for everybody. So this is why, a main reason why we discuss race, right? And of course, we're going to break it down even further in this lecture. So we'll start off with some common myths about race, right? And I want you to think about this. And after I say the question, you can pause the video, you can think about it. If you have roommates, friends, people in class that you talk to, if you're with somebody and y'all are watching this together, feel free, right? But what are some common myths that you have heard about race, right? Common myths that you have heard about race. So just think about that for a while, pause the video, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of these. So a couple of common myths that you may have heard about race, and maybe you've heard some of these that I have on the slide. And obviously, if you have some additional ones, you can think through some of these and see how they may compare to some of the ones that I have on the slide. These are some of the stereotypes, these are some of the myths, or some of the things that we've probably heard about race. First, racism no longer exists, right? This is something that we're going to talk more about when we go into colorblind racism, which is, I think, next week. I think it's August like 12th through the 15th or 13th through 15th, or not August, I keep saying August, September. So it might be the next week anyway. When we go into colorblind racism and colorblind society, we're going to see more and talk more about this idea that racism no longer exists. But this is a myth, right? This idea that racism no longer exists. And this came from, and we're going to talk about it later on, this notion of a post-racial society, right? After the Civil Rights Act was passed, right? 1964 Civil Rights Act. After the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of the 68 or 69. I think I heard 69 the other day. There may have been another version, but I could have sworn it was 68. After all these things were passed, we got rid of that. See, before you could say you could call particularly a Black person colored or the N-word. We can get in trouble for that. You could say it on television. You get in trouble. You might get elected to an office if you do that. So this was racism was very explicit. It was very blatant, in your face. After all these laws were passed, and the federal government said, hey, we have to do something about racial disparities in this country. We have to do something about the explicit racism in this country. Now, if you say the N-word, you could lose your job. You could lose your business. Depending on when you do it and how you do it and what happens subsequently, you could be put in jail. It could be considered a hate crime, right? There are more people in the Black middle class. There are more people, Black professionals, and all. We've even had a Black president. So clearly racism doesn't exist anymore. Racism no longer exists. Now it's about other things, right? And I'll provide a more historical context around that when we do the colorblind lecture, colorblind racism lecture. But this idea, essentially, that race is not a factor or racism no longer exists is a common myth that we hear in society. Especially in the 90s and the 2000s, I would probably say that's less likely to be a thing now. That's less likely to be said now than it was when I was in college, or at least first going to college. It wasn't uncommon to hear white people and people of color say, oh, why are we talking about race? Racism, that's not a thing anymore. I don't hear that as much, maybe because of the people I'm around, I don't hear it a lot. So maybe you can tell me, because you're in college now, you may hear more of a broader discussion than I might hear, in an older age. So I don't know, maybe you can tell me, is that something that people admit to? Does racism still exist? But I think because of social media, because of the widespread conversations and discussions around race, again, it could just be my social media pages or people who I talk to, it's talked about a lot, but it may not be the case in other people's. So like I said, you can tell me, but is racism, do people still believe that racism no longer exists? Right, because I think especially in the last maybe decade, since the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, people can clearly see that race is still an issue in our society. And people of all positions will say that. Politicians, influential people, medical personnel, everybody, right? Still a thing. So that's a common myth, that racism no longer exists, when clearly we see how much it affects, in the issue of race, how much it affects people's everyday lives, and how the disparities are allotted, carried out, or affected along racial lines, whether it be health disparities, whether it be arrests, people who put in jail, people who receive poor education, housing, food, all of the different ways in which we live, how there are these different disparities along racial lines. So clearly racism still exists. It may not be sometimes as blatant in terms of having a whites only sign and a colored only sign, or being able to call somebody the N-word, or being able to call somebody a racial slur on television, and it be okay. But still very much, we live in a racialized society. I don't see race, I see everyone as human. So sometimes maybe we don't see, maybe it's not as likely for somebody to say racism no longer exists, but we have definitely heard people say, I don't see race. No, race isn't a thing. Everybody's human. We're just human beings. And that's not the case. Race is real. Race may not be biologically real, and I think we discussed that in this class, in that there's nothing in our DNA that tells us you are a person of a particular race and you are a person of another race, but we clearly see race. We clearly see color. I remember hearing someone say, if you didn't see color, then why do you stop at a stoplight? You see red, you see yellow, you see green. And guess what? It's not just those colors that you see, but the meaning applied to those colors. There's a meaning when you see red. Immediately you see red and something happens to your body. Right? Stop, or there's a warning, wait. Even if there's no words on it, just red. You might be like, what's going on? If you see green in a certain context, you may feel lighter. Psychologists say it all the time. They use colors because colors depict certain meanings and can exude or evoke a certain emotion out of a person. So color means something. Color means something. And race means something. So clearly we see color, and clearly color has meaning, and we see race. And race has meaning. And there's nothing wrong with race. There's nothing wrong with people being different. It's okay for people to be different. The problem is when we put those differences on a stratification. We'll talk about that later as well. But to say a person doesn't see race, that's a problem, because we should see race, because race denotes a person's reality. Although everybody of the same race does not have the same reality. Every white person doesn't have the same reality. Every Black person doesn't have the same reality. Every Asian person doesn't have the same reality. Every Latinx person doesn't have the same reality. Every Native American does not have the same reality. We're all different in various ways. But what race can do is it can tell you how a person is likely to be able to traverse the US context. It can tell you if a person has been discriminated against or not. You don't know me personally. Well, you do based on some things that I've told you. But if I haven't told you something, then you don't know certain things about me personally, right? But one thing you probably will be able to tell because of my race or because of my perceived race, and my perceived race is very apparent, and we're going to talk about those people whose perceived race may not be apparent all the time. And we're actually going to do an assignment on that later on. But my perceived race is very apparent. I look like I'm Black. It's very clear. It's no passing for me. I'm not light enough to pass for white. So it's very clear that I'm Black. Now, because I'm Black, it doesn't necessarily mean one thing or another thing or another thing, whether I'm educated or not, whether I've been to jail or not, whether I lived in the ghetto or I lived in the suburbs, whether I have millions and millions of dollars or whether I live in poverty. None of these things you'll be able to tell just by looking at me. But what you can tell by looking at me is if I've been discriminated against or not, or the likelihood that I would be discriminated against, or by the likelihood that I've had negative interactions with the police, which those things have occurred. So there are things that you can most likely deduce from a person's race from a societal standpoint, not necessarily about their character. So it's important to see race because race denotes a person's reality, whether good, bad, or indifferent. I see everyone as human. That's a way in which people are trying to say, I don't allow race to dictate the way in which I treat people. And that's fine. That's great. You don't allow race to dictate how you treat somebody or if you treat somebody well or not. That's a better way to say that. But to say you don't see race and you see everybody as human, that's okay to see. You can see people as race beings and as human beings. I can be Black and human. You can be white and human. You can be Asian and human. It's fine. You can be both. It's okay. Right? So again, debunking these myths. They got in because of affirmative action. Many of us may or may not know what affirmative action is. Affirmative action is a set of policies and procedures that were put in place in the late 1960s and 1970s to help level the playing field when it came to creating opportunities for a large majority of minorities in this country. Affirmative action policies were ways in which the federal government provided benefits for businesses and particularly for businesses and for higher educational institutions that made ways to create more acceptance and more opportunities for people of color and women. We're going to talk about this as well, because this is a big question. This is a big, and this can be a very sensitive topic, especially with a lot of white people. Because there are a lot of white people who have a misunderstanding about affirmative action. And they think, oh, that's not fair. My friend didn't get into that. I mean, I've heard it a lot, again, particularly among white students. And they would say, well, Dr. Grant, it's not fair that my friend didn't get into the school, but I know somebody who had grades that weren't as good as their grades and had a score that was lower than my friend's score, but they got in. And I think it was because of affirmative action and diversity. And that's not fair. That's reverse racism. That's reverse discrimination. And again, that's because that's the narrative, but that's not how it works. But that's how a lot of people think it works. So we're going to have an essay about that really gets at affirmative action. And if you want, you can just go ahead and read it for yourself if you want to on your own time. That helps to kind of gain a better understanding of how affirmative action in the past works and how diversity and inclusion policies work today. But that lets us know that race is still a thing because people talk about what's called affirmative action. And this idea that people of color and women are included in this as well, only got certain opportunities because of affirmative action. And that's hurtful to people of color because now the hard work that they put in to become successful, the hard work that they put in to get the same opportunities as their colleagues gets negated simply because they were born of a certain race. Asian Americans are doing fine, so why can't the rest of them? We're going to talk about something called the model minority myth, right? Model minority myth. And that's where this comes from. When we look at all the minorities, right? When we look at Native Americans, we see that there's a clear, there's a history that shows that these people have been ostracized, marginalized, literally murdered, like wipe out millions of them for the sake of land, for the sake of wealth. It's clear that Black people have been discriminated against. It's clear to see a history of discrimination, whether you talk about slavery, Jim Crow, all of these different things. No denying it, right? So you see that, you see Latinx people, you see clear discrimination in terms of the way in which immigration policies are pushed forth, and we're going to talk about that as well, all these different things. But a lot of people look at the Asian Americans and say, well, they're doing well. I don't see a lot of poor Asian Americans. They get into the schools. There's a majority of them at the top schools like Harvard and Princeton and UCLA, and they got top jobs. They're the professors, they're the bankers, they're the millionaires, they make the products. And all of their friends or family members that are still living in these other countries like China and Japan and South Korea and all these different places, these are very, very well-run top countries that are very rich and wealthy. China is the richest country in the world that has not built its wealth off of slave money. The United States still is considered the richest on some charts, but the wealth came from slave money. And the Chinese, not so much. So people may say, well, Asian Americans are doing fine. Look at them. They came to this country and they became successful. Why can't the Blacks do that? Why can't the Latinx people do that? Why can't the Native Americans do that? Instead, they're just protesting and whining and crying about everything. That's a common myth. We're going to talk about that. If you come here, you should learn the language. We're going to talk about language. We're going to get into that. If you come to this country, learn the language. If you don't know the language, I don't know what to tell you. We shouldn't have to accommodate you. That's a topic. That's a myth about race that we need to discuss. I'm not racist. My best friend is, and insert whatever racial group. My best friend is Black. My best friend is Hispanic. My best friend is Asian. I dated an Asian girl. I dated a Black guy. My favorite teacher was Native American, right? All of these different things to say that because that one person I had a positive interaction with, this must mean that I'm not racist. Well, obviously that's not the case. I mean, even if you look back in slavery, there were a lot of racist white people who owned African people who were also so-called nice to them, right? There were many of them that had relationships with other Black people and they were so-called friends. That doesn't mean that it was wrong in what they did. That doesn't mean that they weren't very much blatantly racist and wrong in every way in terms of their treatment towards other human beings. And so it's very important that we realize just because a person has a positive interaction with another person, that doesn't absolve them of racism or absolve them from discrimination. And what that ends up doing is perpetuating it by making the person who you interacted with a token. That is perpetuating tokenism, and that is presenting this idea that this person is the representation of their whole group. So if I like this person, I like their whole group. When you could like a version of that racial group. And because that person, you have similar interests, or there are some things about them that you're okay with, you like that person, not necessarily that entire group. So it's very important that we recognize that. I remember I had a professor who told me, he said, you have a lot of people, particularly men, who disrespect women, but they say, I love my mother. Well, of course you love your mother because your mother gave birth to you, your mother fed you, took care of you. But had your mother not done all those things, you would disrespect her as well. So you don't really love women, and you don't really love your mother as a woman. You love your mother as a caretaker. That's what you love about her, not because she's a woman, if you're okay with disrespecting other women. So it's extremely important for us to be able to look at that and realize how sometimes we can separate the race from the person, and we can put people as a sum of all of these kind of parts and pick and choose what we like and then try to apply it in a way that absolves us from discrimination and racism and essentially hatred. So these are just a couple of the myths that you've probably heard about race, that we are going to discuss this and many, 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 many more, right? So even though we live in a post-racial society, many people are still uncomfortable talking or hearing people talk about race, right? Even though it's 2021, even though we see race all over the place, even though we've had a Black president, there's still some people who don't like it. Even though we see Black people on TV and positions of high status, we still don't like it. And so I want us to look at this clip. All right, so let's share the screen. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see this.
Like once you get
but
in,
what if they cross you?
If they, I cry. Like if they cry.
Wait, y'all, you guys, in between this show and all the breaks, all she does is eat these sweet tarts. You're just like a sweet tart, soft on the, or hard on the outside, soft
in the middle.
and loving.
No, I really am not. I'm not busting windows out of no one's car. Also because I do not want to be indicted.
She's also smart.
No, I'm actually a great girlfriend. And if you do me dirty, I really just come on and in my dressing room, I just talk about you. Like, that's really all that happens.
Well, I think that's the metaphor. I don't think you physically would do it. I think that you like,
and shout to Jasmine, because that's my dog.
Exactly.
Yeah,
we got that. All right.
Guess what, guys? We have time for one more. It's from Instagram user Sita.Fanaki, and it reads, can we get at comic Lonnie Love and Amanda Seales to shut up about making everything about race?
Wow.
Not everyone is out to get a sister rolling eyes emoji. It's so frustrating watching every topic be made into an overweight issue or race.
Wow.
We get it, you're Black and proud. Good for you, but not everyone is out to get you to stop making everything about race. Shaking my head emoji. Reading that for the first time.
That was just so hard and unnecessary. That was
Can
really
you hear
hard
my
and
violin?
unnecessary to even read that comment. I don't like it.
I don't
like it because this show is based on women of color.
Yes.
If you can't take 2 minutes of us talking about race,
Of an issue that's
something's wrong with you then. And you know what? We all talk about race.
Yes.
I'm sorry. You were supposed to answer. Go ahead.
Well, it was, you know what? I will, you know, don't diss my sis or this sis or the sisters that we speak on behalf of. Because at the end of the day, the truth of the matter is race is a really big part of this country's issue, this world's issues. And if we're not speaking about it, then it gets pretended like it doesn't exist, and it ends up being something that is just existing in silence, even though it needs to be addressed with volume in order for it to go away.
Yes.
And the truth of the matter is that it may frustrate you. It may frustrate you because it's an inconvenient truth. But on the other hand, it makes so many of our other listeners feel seen, for us to speak about their experiences, for us to speak about what they are talking about with their friends in their own group chat. So really, I hope that this person, after getting their vent out, because they vented, get it out, I hope what you do in exchange now is consider the fact that, you know what? There's other people's perspectives that matter. And maybe I should consider listening, like Jenny was talking about earlier in the show.
Listening! Listen!
And
Who needs to listen?
And I have to say, I'm so thankful to be able to hear all of your experiences so that you can flag things that we may not know in our own skin, in our own situations. So thank you for being open and vulnerable about those things so that I can learn. We love reading what you have to say, but don't just come for us now. Don't do that.
Okay. So hopefully you were able to see and hear that. But if not, you can always just click the link. And so you see that that clip dates back to, I believe, 2020. And so even now, you know, people still are uncomfortable with talking about race. And very similar to what Lonnie said, if you can't take a few minutes to hear somebody talk about race, then maybe it is something that we need to talk about, number one. And then number two, is if we really want to see change happening in society, then we need to listen to different people's reality. And so people of the dominant racial group need to listen to the realities and the conversations and the experiences of the people of the non-dominant racial group, right? And people of the dominant gender need to listen to the experiences of people that are in gender or gender identities that are not as popular or not as accepted. And take that all throughout the various social locations that we inhabit. It is important for us to not try to silence someone because we don't feel comfortable with what it is that they're saying, or try to dismiss someone's reality because it doesn't fit with our reality, right? And in order for us to really be able to move forward, we have to be able to listen to those things and allow people to be as open and as vulnerable and as loud as they need to be in order to be heard and be seen and be valued. And so with that being said, again, this idea that we live in a post-racial society came from something. So what event happened that made our society so-called post-racial? Think about it. You can pause the video, think about it, come up with the answers in your head. What event made our society post-racial? Some of you may say Trayvon Martin. Some of you may say civil rights movement. Some of you may say Civil War. Some of you may say Black Lives Matter. But the event that moved our society into what some people consider a post-racial society, go to the next slide, was this racial project called Obama's presidency, the presidency of Barack Obama. And we're going to talk about this more later, but when Obama was elected president, many people felt that, wow, we finally did it. We finally moved forward. We finally moved into a post-racial society. Why? How? Because President Obama identifies as Black and society identifies him as Black. So for all intents and purposes, although he's half white, he's Black. And he was voted president. He was voted president in a country where the majority of people, the majority of voters, are white. And while it can be difficult to win the presidency without the Black vote or without the minority vote, he was able to secure that and secure a large portion of the white vote. So because President Obama was essentially put into that office by white people, the idea is that, well, then race isn't an issue. Because if race was still an issue in this country, white people would not want a Black president. They would not want to be led by a Black man. So absolutely, this is for sure a post-racial society. White people ain't looking at race no more, or they wouldn't have voted for this Black man. And while Obama's presidency did usher in a new phase in American history, and it did show a certain level of change that to some people may symbolize a type of progression, a type of moving forward, there were a lot of negative responses to his presidency. Can you think about any negative responses to Obama's presidency? What were some things that occurred with his presidency that caused people to respond in a way that was harsh, in a way that was negative, in a way that was mean, and sometimes even in a way that was racist? So I want you to think about that. I can think of a few things, right? Obama, I remember when President Obama was giving a speech, I think it was at the State of the Union address. Somebody told him, "You lie," while he was giving a speech. Highly disrespectful, something that I don't think had ever been done in the United States, to tell a sitting president that he is a liar. President Obama, there have been cartoons of him and his wife as terrorists. There have been cartoons of his wife looking like a monkey. There have been anti-Obama protests, lots and lots and lots of protests. There has been rhetoric. There have been people who became famous for being anti-Obama, and to a larger degree, many of them were racist or could definitely be viewed as racist, right? What was that guy's name? I forgot. Yeah, I can't remember his name, but he has a radio show, and he was very much anti-Obama. Very much anti-Obama. I can't remember his name. I think it starts with an R. I can't remember. So there have been all kinds of responses, negative responses to President Obama's time in office. More so, probably the biggest response was the election of Donald Trump. One of the main reasons why Donald Trump was elected was because many people did not like President Obama. He said it in an interview. Definitely many people's hatred for him and hatred for the policies that he pushed forward caused many of them to say, we want something totally different. And we want the exact opposite of President Obama. And I don't know if you can get more opposite of President Obama than Donald Trump, right? And so that was a response. That was a response by many, many, many members of society that felt they did not like President Obama's reign, his time in office. And so these were some of the responses, and many of these would be considered negative responses to his presidency, showing that no, we did not move into a post-racial America, especially because shortly after President Obama's ascendancy into office, maybe about a year or two later, this is when you start seeing in social media these continually perpetual, incessant murders of Black boys and girls and men and women, and the justice system, or the injustice system in many of these cases, allowing for their murderers to go free, or allowing them to have very small amounts of minimal amounts of time in jail if they got jail time at all. So while Obama was definitely elevated, there were all of these other Black people and people of color who were experiencing atrocities and experiencing a negative reality when it came to race, to the point where maybe to some people it was post-racial, but to the large majority, particularly of Black people during that time, race is still a very, very important factor in their lives. And so it is situations like President Obama's inauguration and ascendancy to the presidency is what we call a racial project. A racial project is part of a larger theory called racial formation theory. And racial formation theory was put forth by Michael Omi and Howard Winott more softly, more formally called OMI and whatnot. This idea of a racial project is said to be an interpretation or a representation or an explanation of how racial identities and meanings can be an effort to organize and distribute resources, whether they're economic resources, political resources, cultural resources, along racial lines. It is a way in which people use identities and meanings to redistribute resources along racial lines. And we'll talk about some examples of this as well. So racial projects can be something that is done for white people to help maintain white superiority. A racial project could also be done by a person of color to help redistribute resources equally. Okay. So racial projects, again, are ways in which certain situations, representations, and explanations have these identities and meanings that are used to help redistribute resources. Racial projects is something that is done on more of a micro level, more of an individual level, as opposed to systemic racism, which is largely structural, much bigger. And so racial projects, what OMI and would not say, is they connect the meaning of race in discourse and ideology with the actual social structures that are racially organized. So the same conversations that we have among each other, behind closed doors, in the classroom, at the family dinner table, they're also connected to the ways in which our medical industries function, our criminal justice system functions, our housing system functions, banking, job structure, employment structure, educational system. And all of these things are racially organized. All of these things have, to some degree, a racial reality where you can see a stratification along racial lines. And all of those things are just named. Whether you're talking about who gets loans for banks or who gets loans for houses and how much they get, whether you're talking about who are the most likely to receive and benefit from an education, who's most likely to have large amounts of student loans, who's most likely to be arrested, who's most likely to, all these different things. And so we look at what happens on the lower level, we connect it to the structures to see how these structures are racially organized. Now, the reason why they're called racial projects is because they reflect and respond to broader patterns of race. Sometimes they respond to it by reproducing it. Sometimes they respond to it by challenging it. That's why President Obama's ascendancy to the White House will probably be considered a racial project that was used to try to challenge the broader patterns of race. What was the broader pattern of race it was looking to challenge? The broader pattern of race that people of color, particularly Black people, are underrepresented in the political sphere. This broader pattern that if you look through all of the presidents, all of the US presidents, not one was a person of color. And so President Obama's ascendancy to the White House says, we are trying to subvert, we are trying to challenge another racial project. This racial project is looking to challenge this broader pattern of race. But then sometimes racial projects are done to reproduce broader patterns of race or reproduce racism, i.e., the Native Americans being removed off their land. That was a racial project. It was a project that used race as a way to perpetuate superiority for white folks and inferiority for a person of color, and concentrate capital into the hands of white people. the treatment of illegal immigrants is a racial project. There's a reason why, and we're going to talk about this later, there's a reason why the immigration laws are sometimes, and even more, as why they are sometimes the same as or even more difficult to understand than the tax laws. And if you know anything about the US tax laws, I mean, you have to be a genius to know how to read that stuff. The common person cannot read those tax laws. And if you read the immigration laws, they read about the same. It's very, very, very detailed and difficult and a lot of loopholes. And it's a huge maze and it's made like that on purpose. So illegal treatment, illegal immigrant treatment, Black women as welfare queens. We're going to talk about that later. But this idea that Black women are welfare queens, that particularly poor Black women are just sitting in the ghetto, sitting in the hoods, and just collecting a check from all the hardworking Americans who are having money taken out of their check every month and given to these poor people, particularly poor Black women who all they want to do is sit up and have babies all day so they can collect a check from the government. That's a racial project used to reproduce racism, because that same idea was used to then create something. And we may read, I don't know if we're reading this book, but there's a book called Killing the Black Body. Not Harriet Washington. Who wrote Killing the Black? I always forget that lady's name. Killing the Black Body, not Collins. Forgot her name. But Killing the Black Body, which shows how this idea of the welfare queens was then used to justify the immoral and illegal use of forcing neutralization tactics, forcing not vaccines, but Norplant medicine into women to keep them from having babies, forcing essentially women to be sterilized. And then at one point, when they realized that obviously that's immoral, inhumane, stuff like that was done in Nazi Germany, right? And the United States is supposed to be better than that, then they would use things like money. I'll pay you $500 so that you don't have a child for this amount of time. For 5 years, put this thing in your body so you don't have a child for this amount of time. And it was targeted to people of color, particularly Black women, used or justified by this idea of Black women as welfare queens. Okay, we're gonna talk about all of that. But it is these types of situations, these types of issues, these types of actions that are the reason why Omi and Winnot call them racial projects, because they either reproduce racism or they try to subvert it. Can you think of any other racial projects? Think about some other racial projects that come to your mind. Obviously, Black Lives Matter and the rise of Black Lives Matter as a movement and the movement for Black lives. These types of organizations, these types of movements are racial projects that challenge the racial project of mass incarceration. Right? So there's many, many, many more. But hopefully you have an understanding. And again, this is from racial formation theory. That's what this is from. You have like racial formation theory, systemic racism theory, all these different theories that help us understand how race works in the US context. So last lecture or last slide that has additional info. So what kind of relationships do white people have with their ethnicity? Or what are some cultural expressions that white Americans display that are significant to their whiteness and their ethnicity? So think about it. How do white people express their ethnicity and whiteness? Take some time, think about it. You can pause the video here. If we think about it, white people's relationship to whiteness and relationship to their ethnicity is symbolic at best. Doesn't run very deep. Doesn't run very deep. Their relationship is symbolic, and only on certain days like St. Patrick's Day, Independence Day, do you see white people embracing their whiteness. The 4th of July, celebrate America, celebrate the United States, freedom. St. Patrick's Day, celebrate being Irish. But now maybe in Ireland it might be different, but I'm talking about in the United States. But there are very few examples of white people needing and wanting to preserve their ethnic culture. There are very few examples of that, of white people wanting to fight for them in a way that is not violent. Because we see the rise of the Klan, we see the rise of, like, I think it was called the White Citizens Council. These types of organizations were done to preserve white Southern heritage, Confederate heritage, antebellum life for white people. Yeah, that definitely occurred. But I'm talking about just in general, every day, especially in today's day and age, we don't see a lot of cultural expressions for white Americans. But for people of color, it's very different. Because race is significant in the way that people of color live their lives. And it is displayed, and it is an ongoing process. It's in the way in which people of color eat, the way they communicate, the way they think, the way they behave, the way they behave. All of these things are based on race. So race is a heightened consciousness. It's a heightened idea that people who are non-white always think about, or they always have to think about. I don't know if we went over Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk and double consciousness yet, but that's one of the things that Du Bois talks about in his double consciousness theory. Black people specifically always have to think about being Black. So everything they do is related to their culture. Everywhere they go, because everywhere they go, they are reminded that they don't belong, or that they're not wanted, or that they're not seen as human or regular, or that they're an exception, or they're made to feel like they're an exception. So it's important to understand race, and it is important particularly for white people to understand race, because white people don't have to think about it. So when they say, oh, racism doesn't exist, or race isn't a big deal, that's because it's not a big deal to them. But it is everything to a non-white person. Because if you're white, you don't have to think about race, because race doesn't affect you. Because everywhere you go, you are accepted, you are appreciated, you see examples of yourself, you know yourself, you see reflections of yourself. Everything is made for you. Everything is made for white people in Western worlds. Whiteness, white privilege, it's all normal. So it's not white life, it's just life. That's just the reality. And that's how the Western world was constructed. It was made that way. It didn't just happen. It was created that way through policies. It was created that way through economic systems. It was created that way through changes in education, and changes in politics, and changes in religion. It was constructed that way. So whiteness and white privilege was made to be invisible. It's not supposed to be seen, because what is whiteness or what is white is just what is regular or normal. We're gonna do an activity. I gotta make sure I add that in. I think you all are gonna like it, but it's an activity by Peggy McIntosh. It's a white woman who studies race. And it's really good. A lot of students like it. You may have done it in another class, but a lot of students really like it. And it helps us gain an understanding of how normal whiteness really is in our society. But she does whiteness and maleness. So she also talks about how normal maleness is. As a Black person, I could get the race part, but the male part out, I didn't quite understand until I realized, oh, I never really thought about having to do that, or having that experience, or because I'm a man, I don't have to think about that, right? So whiteness and white privilege is invisible because it's normal. So again, for most white students, they don't see it. They don't see the need to have these conversations. And so college makes students, again, usually white students, have to think about race, especially when they take classes like this, more so than they did in the past. But the reason why is because everything about college centers white people. The classes usually are either majority white, or the curriculum is very much white-centered. White people, white professors, white authors, white perspective on whatever it is being taught. The food generally caters towards more white people. Organizations are usually run, operated, or mentored. Student organizations may have a white mentor. So everything about the college experience is usually white. So when there are other groups that are specific to a particular race, or racial affinity groups or programs, or even HBCUs, like historically Black colleges, like Edward Waters College in Jacksonville, Florida Memorial University in Miami, FAMU, wherever. Many times white people feel left out because that's not quote unquote normal, because what is normal is whiteness. So if you see an HBCU, or you see a Black organization, or you see the African Student Union, or you see the, they used to call it a LASSO office in another university that I worked at, but the Latin American student office, or wherever, right? It seems like, well, why is that necessary? Why can't they just be with the rest of the students? Why can't they just be with us? Well, that's because being with the normal takes away from their uniqueness. And many times their experiences have not been accepted in the normal as of yet. Why? Because race is still an issue in our society, and racism is still very prevalent. And so in order for these minority groups, these racial minority groups, to be themselves and to feel normal and to feel like they belong, they have to curate spaces for themselves. And a lot of times that relationship, that relationship with things like college or other major kind of milestones, it's necessary for people of color to be able to do that. And it's also necessary for white people or their white friends to be able to see why that's important and allow for that to be, and maybe even learn from that, so that we can be able to grow together, right, as a community, as a larger human community. When first exposed, many times white people will respond with hostility or defense when they are exposed to or accused of being racially insensitive or being racist or whatever. And they say, no, just like what we said earlier, I have a insert minority racial group here friend. I have a white friend, I have a Native American friend. I used to date a Hispanic, Latinx, Latina woman. I used to date an Asian guy, right? And so when first exposed, many times this is the response. However, the relationship with that friend a lot of times lacks depth. Many times people say, oh, I have a Black friend. Do you know that Black friend's last name? Have you ever been to that Black friend's house? Have you ever met that Black friend's family? Anything. Probably not. I'm not going to speak for everybody here. I'm just saying, in general, that's typically not the case. Again, based on science, it's typically not the case. I remember, I think I was talking to a friend of mine, and I stated that I have never been, outside of a colleague, I've never been invited to a white person's house for dinner. Just, I've been to white churches, I've been to, yeah. I don't think I've ever in my life, I'm in my 30s, I don't think I've ever in my life been invited to a white person's house for dinner. But I have colleagues, and so sometimes my colleagues, people that I've worked with, may have something at their house, or as a PhD student, my professors, they would have events for the department at their house, and so we would then all get invited. Yeah, I think that's it, right? Not to say that I didn't have a good relationship with my colleagues or a good relationship with certain white people throughout my life, but if I'm honest, was it substantial? Probably not. I'll give another example. When I first graduated from high school, I actually went to, it's called Florida State College at Jacksonville now, but it was called FCCJ, Florida Community College at Jacksonville. So I went there for school right after high school. And I had a friend, I won't say her name, I'll give you a fake name. Her name was Marie, right? So I had a friend named Marie, and she was a white woman. She was my age, maybe like 18, 19. And we were really close. And after class, we would meet in the like student center, and we would hang out, we would play pool, we would listen to music, we would do our homework. And we would just talk for hours. And just was always, a lot of times we were together after class, we would come and we would talk about our classes. And I was taking this African American studies class, and I would talk to her about that. She was taking, whatever humanities class, and we would talk about that. And we were just really close. I remember one time we were talking about places that we go in the city in terms of clubs. So I talked to her about this hip hop club that me and my friends would go to on weekends. And she talked to me about this country club, this club that played country music that she would go to with her friends. And so I said, oh man, one day we need to take each other to each other's clubs. So she said, okay, that'll be real cool. And so she said, you wouldn't mind coming to one of my country clubs? And I said, nah. I said, I don't know a whole lot of country music songs, but I wouldn't mind coming and seeing what it's like. I've seen it on television, but I've never been there, and I'm always open to new experiences. So yeah, that's cool, I'm down. So she said, okay. And so, she said, okay, we can set it up for, I think it was a Thursday. So she said, okay, we can set it up for Thursday. I said, okay, cool. So I said, well, where do you live? Like, what side of town do you live on? She told me what side of town she lived on. I said, oh, I literally live like 15 minutes from you. I can just come by and I can just pick you up on the way to the place, so you don't have to waste gas. And she was like, oh, okay, yeah, that'll be great. And then she thought about it. She said, oh, you know what? I don't know if that's a good idea. I was like, well, why not? I mean, you're going to meet me there, but I literally have to pass your house to get to the place. So why don't I just pick you up? And she was like, well, so I have to be honest with you. You can't pick me up because my dad, I mean, he's not racist or anything. That was the first thing. That was the response. She said, he's not racist or anything, but, and I was like, I get it. Not a problem. We could just meet at at the club, at the club that she was taking me to. And she was like, okay, I just didn't want it to be a thing. I was like, nah, I get it. I understand, right? I say all that to say, me and this person was cool, and I'm pretty sure, I haven't seen her in a long time, but I'm pretty sure even if I saw her today, we would have great conversation. We would reminisce, talk about old times, whatever. But did that relationship have depth? No. Or substance? Maybe not. Because of the issues around race in the larger society, the issues around race in her family. the issue that bringing this black guy into her house or her dad seeing her with this black guy hanging out could potentially cause some problems, right? And so we have to be honest about it. And instead of trying to explain it away by saying, well, I have a black friend, I dated a Latinx or Latino guy or whatever, let's be honest and say, no, there's these larger issues that are keeping us from being even closer that we really have to talk about and deal with, right? And so that is why these larger discussions around race are very much necessary. So let's go to the next lecture or the next slide. You have an assignment, a class assignment, and it's called A Trip to the Grocery Store. So it's going to be under your class assignments on Canvas. It's going to be called A Trip to the Grocery Store. And what I want you to do is I want you to watch this clip. It's only about 3 to 5 minutes. It's not long, but it's really, really powerful. And it really does a good job of explaining how funny it is that a simple trip to the grocery store can be a life lesson on race. So watch this clip, and then I want you to write a 1-page reflection paper explaining your thoughts on this video. Based on this story, why is it important to have open and honest conversations and educational discourse about race? And I want you to use examples from this story in your answer. If Kathleen had not been educated and conscious on race, what would have been some alternative ways in which that store interaction could have gone? So had Kathleen not responded the way she did, what else could have happened, right? What else, could have been done that could have heightened the situation in a negative way or been very detrimental for some people? Have you seen someone use, or you yourself have used your privilege to combat inequalities, right? So if, let's say you're a person of color, have you seen somebody use white privilege to combat inequalities? Or if you are a white person, have you ever used your privilege to combat inequalities? Or you could even make it larger if you're a male or if you're middle class or whatever, or you're heterosexual. Have you used your privilege to combat some level of inequality? So we can even expand from race here in this section if we want. But most of our conversations are going to be around race. So explain that. And the paper should be double-spaced Times New Roman 12 font. The only information that should be at the top of the page is your name, the name of the class, and the title of the essay. You can have that's optional. And the deadline to submit this is Friday, September 10th at 1:50. So make sure that you submit under class assignments, and you're going to submit this 1-page reflection paper under there by Friday, September 10th at 1:50. So make sure y'all pay attention to the deadlines, and because some, they can change. They generally are around like the same time, but they can change. And there's a reason for that. So yeah. Anyway, that is it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you have any comments, I've been enjoying some of you who've been entering the office hours and our conversations. Some of you have been just sending me emails or messages about the lectures and your ideas around those. So I thank you for that as well. Yeah, anything you want to talk about, again, office hours are open. If those office hours don't work for you, let me know. And we can set up a time. I've definitely set up some alternate times for other students so that we can have conversations. I know that we're separate because of COVID. So hopefully this is a way for us to be more personal and this to appear more personal outside of you just watching lecture videos. So look forward to seeing you in office hours. Have a great day. Have a great weekend, depending on when you're watching this, and you'll see me soon. And I hope to see you in the office hours.